Good evening. Thank you, Becken. Thank you to the Kosovo Architecture Festival. I mean, I realize being the last and it's late. We all want to possibly go to dinner. So I'm going to try and be as short as I can, even though I suppose that the topic I will try to elaborate on is fairly dense. And when Becken sort of first shared sort of the topic, the wider sort of theme of this year's Kosovo Architecture Festival, which sort of for full disclosure, I think this is my second participation in the festival, although the first one was in 2020 during COVID, so I was not able to travel to Pristina back then. And so the city after crisis, I felt sort of it resonated a lot with work that I've been doing, and I hope that sort of somehow the presentation I'm going to go through right now is able to explain why and give some insights to that. And the title I've chosen to today, which is slightly varied or modified from the original one, is Rubble as Ground, and there are two words there that I would like to begin with, because everything I will say will come back to them. And the second one, I think, is more important for me than the first, and I'll hopefully start with that and end with the other, because over the last 20 years or so, I've been really obsessed with notions of ground in a number of forms, and I suppose that one of the privileges of my condition, which is currently a professor of architecture and has been for a while, is to ask questions I have absolutely no answer to. And the idea is to have to unpack sort of what is ground, no? And is it just a given thing, the surface we start from, a neutral floor beneath the drawing? And it's none of the above, right? It's something that can be read, that can be emptied, that can be destroyed, and it is lived upon while all of that is happening at once. And I speak to you from that conviction, and I speak to you in Pristina, which surely is a place that has lived through destruction, through contested reconstruction, through... What's happening? Yeah. Through the long argument about what gets rebuilt and for whom. So what I offer in the following is a shared vantage point rather than a lesson carried in from elsewhere. And everybody here in the audience would know what it means when the ground and the political arrive together. And so I want to sort of set the shape of this talk only once. And Edward Said famously wrote that none of us is outside or beyond geography, and that the struggle over it runs through ideas, through forms, through images and imaginings. I take that as a permission, including the permission to think and speak about places, about countries I do not belong to, where I'm an external, a viewer or actor, from a distance, which is where I stand. I hold no illusion that a lecture rebuilds anything, and I hold instead Said's smaller and harder claim that the imaginings matter, that how we picture a ground or the ground is already part of the fight over it. And one image sits with what Said just said at the threshold before the argument begins, and it's a map where I deliberately turn the world upside down. And so that it reads from the south. It reorders what counts as a center and what counts as an edge, which knowledge is treated as local and which is treated as universal, which ground is figure and what one is background. The lecture is constructed as a diptych, 3 movements from the African continent and 4 pivoting around Palestine along a meridian. And the idea is not so much that the meridian as a geographical location, but rather in thinking with the way Franco Cassano articulated in '96 as a meridional thinking in action, working with, from, and across what is generally referred to as the global south. And you could read through them across the fold, grounding against ungrounding, communities against seeds, extraction against wound, and one last movement stands alone. Rubble, with no partner. It stands alone because it is the present condition where we live in, And it's not one of post or after the conflict, it's actually one of enduring conflict. And that breaks is the point I'm trying to bring across. Abdul Malik Simon, a geographer, famously articulated that African cities, but really many cities, are characterized by incessantly flexible, mobile, and provisional intersections of residents. I begin the African life half of the story because that's sort of the first experience that allowed me to problematize what ground is as something made from below, provisional, ahead of any plan. And I did not understand that initially. I was born in Venice. I studied architecture in Switzerland, and I started both teaching and practicing in the Swiss Alps. And my experience of ground was through the section in the modernist sort of movements idea, where topography is a technique and the line describes a slope. That training had to be unlearned. When I began working across Eastern and Southern Africa, the ground stopped being a technique and became a relation. In the work I later gathered under the title Architectural Topographies, I was teaching myself to read landscapes, material, rural and urban conditions, before I dared to propose anything upon them. But it was the encounter with the Rift Valley, right? Sort of that tectonic line that connects the plates of Eastern and Western Africa and clashes that changed radically sort of my understanding of what land is. Historically a place of conflict is today a very vibrant place, with still ongoing conflicts, where large-scale projects are taking place, new capital cities are planned, but also where there is still a primary need for access to shelter, health, and education, largely unaddressed by contemporary design research. And in Rwanda, where I moved to in 2011, the land of the thousand hills, the ground is constantly anthropized and man-made, right? Because it is cultivated, it is extracted, it is made to produce sustenance for a growing population. In Kigali, the green sections and in the timber structures, you can watch ground being built from below, out of the earth, out of labor, rather than handing down from a zoning diagram. And what then is a plan? The master plan of the colonial project, the one that in 1968 imagined sort of Kigali as a liberated capital for a young democracy, or the one that Singapore technocrats imported and spent and offered to the Vision 2030 and 2050 of the young continent. What are the clocks, the times that intertwine and overlap in the two confronting visions? The reticence keep one time, the incremental and provisional time of a place actually being inhabited, repaired, extended, and inhabited again. And the clock instead of modernization, of colonization, of turbo-capitalism. And when the two clocks disagree, and they most often do, the ground is where the disagreement gets settled. And Rwanda is clearly also a country which in '94 shared a sort of a historical genocide, right? So it's a time where one finds again over and over the problems that one speaks to. Achille Mbembe and Sarah Nuttall write about an epistemological abyss, right? About scholarship, about difficulty of knowing Africa through inherited European certainties, looking at the world from an African metropolis. And I want to bend this line a little towards building, because the abyss they describe, not simply epistemological, is also precisely the condition of arriving to build within a community on whose terms you did not set. And so a lot of design work that I'm showing in passing of master plans that I was involved with in Rwanda most recently asks, what is the community? What is a community? And what is the plan that fits that? What are processes of planning, of dialogue? And how can design act as an instrument of that discussion? Over many years, through many collaborative practices, I've helped to design and build mostly early childhood development centers, community centers, schools, health facilities in both urban context and rural context. Stuff that never got built, like this neighborhood center in Kigali, but hopefully someday will get off the ground. But dealing mostly also with conditions of scarcity, right? And what is that condition? What is a world of scarce and limited resources, and how can that condition allow for invention rather than be seen as something that is lacking when there is little, when every decision needs to be shared, every material being accounted for, every hand visible in the result? A roof becomes a negotiation, a foundation a meeting. The building, in the end, matters less than the ecology of relations that assemble around it. And the first building I was really involved with that managed to get off the ground now, over almost 15 years ago, was an amazing experience. In 35 days to build off the ground this early childhood development center for a small community in the Bugesera region in southern Rwanda. And under conditions of real material scarcity, but the center in and of itself became an occasion for the community to gather itself. The school, a reason for people to hold a piece of ground in common and to keep holding it after the architect has gone. We once drew it as a hierarchy, present into neighborhood, into community, in sort of the modernist CM grid, but as though it was a diagram of scales, the Charles and Ray Eames' power of 10, and sort of this idea of the zooming in and out and trying to understand things in a linear relationship. But that's not quite the fact. The truer picture sits in the photographs of people building and cultivating together, because what they show is not designing for, it is knowing with. And so the abyss that Nuttall and Bembe helped us think about is also the one that you cannot determine in advance, and you build your own way towards knowing it alongside the people who already do. And I clearly have learned more standing on these ecosystemic sites, I'm sure in a number, than in any other studio where I could draw. And that lesson is chimes the same, that the ground was not mine to give, it was theirs to keep. And the task was to help them keep it. But what looks like a lush landscape, and here are images from Zambia, where again the process got repeated, different partnerships, different studio, different conditions, but similar approach. The vibrant ecosystem also raises a fundamental question. Whose land is it? And Brenda Bandehart famously helped us sort of understand sort of ideas of property regime in colonial times, built on the ideology of improvement, declaring unregistered, unworked land empty and available. The machinery of dispossession is plainly tainted. And that coincided also with my move to South Africa in 2015 to take up the directorship at the School of Architecture in the University of Cape Town, and coming to terms with the legacy of the apartheid project, right? Sort of the ultimate sort of 20th century culmination of a segregationist and colonialist enterprise that segregated on the basis of ethnicity and confiscated all the land. So declaring that land is unimproved and declare it empty, make it available, and land that was otherwise worked by people whose labor the law refuses to recognize falls out of legal sight altogether. Improvement sounds like care. In this grammar, it is a license to take or steal. And sort of the diagrams of then what is a company town. Cape Town is established for the East Indian a company that needs a victualling point in the journey of its ships from the Netherlands to the Far East, and hence then is characterized by the fort, where the military are, by the gardens, which needs to be cultivated in order to produce fresh product, and the European housing block. All the rest, the African city, the indigenous city, is thought of as somewhere else. And the diagram, the prototypical diagram of the company city, then is replicated in a number of other places, northwards and upwards. In that sense, infrastructure, in this case the railway, is not meant to bring travel experience, but rather to facilitate the extraction of goods from inland to the harbors and then loaded on ships that then bring it back to Europe to accumulate richness. And so segregation becomes a matter of altitude and orientation. Some are sent up the hill into air and green and distance, others are held down by the tracks, by the smoke, by the work. The plan is a machine for sorting bodies by ground, and it does its sorting in the calm language of drainage and prevailing wind.
Sembra che derive from the English word stint, to describe the series of connected railway carriages with wagons, moved by a power locomotive vehicle or by integral motors.
And Hugh Masekela's, a sort of South African jazz composer, a song Stimela that refers onomatopoeically, right, to the steam and to the chongololo, the centipede, in terms of sort of the experience akin to the sort of banality of running along the tracks, speak about local history and the migrant labor system on the mines, reminding everyone that South Africa's wealth and infrastructure was built on the back of labor from all over Africa. And in that sense, a transition to projects which started dealing with more creative outputs, installations, research projects, were the occasion to start dealing with how do we represent that sort of investigation? How do we represent that knowledge? An installation for the Seoul Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism in 2021 centered on Harare, Zimbabwe, and railway tracks in the middle of the town, helped sort of laid bare sort of what happens at the heart of the Company Town project. Again, Zimbabwe, formerly Northern Rhodesia, a private country established by Cecil Rhodes for his own private wealth accumulation, with support by the Queen of England, is about sort of the greedy extraction of resources for the settlers and the occasion to write their own reading of history. And in Harare, as in many other African cities, railway lines express a division, a barrier. The aim of our project was to illustrate how operating in and upon segregated terrains compounded by the complexity of post-pandemic life calls for geographical imaginaries that go beyond the tectonic artifice and asymmetrical land use planning. A model of resistors, a fiction mindful of what Achille Mbembe's reminded that Foucault calls a line is in definition a dispositif, a device, nothing linear. And that helped us engage with so-called African practices of the everyday life, alternative, contextually driven, holistic future cityscapes in which all, especially historically marginalized people, would be able to thrive and walk. Or, as in this other image, as in miners raised against the locomotive and the gesture of revolt that I want to cross in the second half of the talk. Soil, we've articulated, is a prerequisite of life. It holds the resources on which it depends. Today, Wiseman, in the preface of the third edition to Hollow Land that came out a couple of years ago, and again in his latest Ungrounding, reminds us that it is ungrounded poison, and with it so is life. And this is the hinge of the discussion, of the argument, along the meridian. On the African side, the ground was made and emptied. On Palestine, the ground is attacked as ground, as the very conditions of living. The distinction matters. To empty a ground is to take its people off it. To unground is to poison, and again I think that there's an important clarification to be made as ground as noun and ground as verb, which is to ground or to unground. To poison the earth itself so that even return would be a return to something that can no longer sustain. I do not enter Palestine through catastrophe. I entered through walking. I first traveled to the occupied territories in 2019. And the book that captures sort of my first recollections of it, that I edited, titled Land Walks Across Palestine and South Africa, was heavily influenced obviously by Raya Shahadeh's Palestinian Walks, where he introduces two sort of different words in Arabic. One is harha, to roam freely, at will, without restraint, and shatha, that refers to longer walks, without productive purposes. And the collection of endeavors and reflections across South Africa and Palestine, which was enabled by a research grant I won at the University of Cape Town in 2020, was really to move on foot through seeds, through territories, through the slow reading of a contested surface. I say this deliberately because I want you to sort of share my first meeting of a place of tending, of stone terraces, of olive roots and careful water before the current imagery of ruins. And in that the archive became a sound archive, and this is Marha Khalifa reflecting on the publication in a presentation in Johannesburg.
Getting this sense of solidarity that we're not alone in this, we're together in this. I'm going to be reading some of my thoughts because I am having a hard time concentrating. I have this battle in my head, drawing reflections, comparisons, negotiations between home and here, and what the future looks like for Palestinian, thinking of all of that all of the time. I was talking to Tanzim before, one of the authors here. I told her that I got the chance to visit Gaza in 2018, and when I left Gaza, because it's under siege and it's as if it's not, we do Palestinians in the West Bank or inside of Palestine 48, that is Israel today, cannot go to Gaza. I got the chance to visit it, and ever since I left it, I have this feeling in my heart, this ache. It aches because I left my people there doing nothing. I think I have this feeling, the same feeling ever since I left Cape Town. So I'm sorry for being emotional as well.
And so I think that the discussion, this was taped in 2023, but early 23, before the new war and genocide started, is to try and draw a parallel and link between South Africa and occupied Palestine, and then also raise the awareness around sort of something of missing, a void of sorts. And Philippe de Buc and Sami Balogi have clearly sort of articulated that as a whole. And it's a really important and productive trope that they offer us that opens this side of the fold, and write that the whole expresses the dismal quality of living in the post-colonial city, is what extraction leaves in the surface, its signature, the negative of the ground, the whole of the mine, of the crater, of the strike, the same wound in the earth read twice. But it's against that whole, right, that we are trying to discuss and trying to imagine a ground that answers with something small and stubborn, and where this movement begins. And around the same time, I edited a book for the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, where I'd been involved in as an on-site reviewer of the Palestinian Museum in Birzeit, that was possibly untemporarily titled Architecture of Commonality, Grounds for Hope. And the subtitle sort of meant seriously, although sort of events clearly contradicted, and our, let's say, sentiment. But it was important because I think it centered the notion of what is the Palestinian Museum as an institution. For those you know, sort of a place in Birzeit, on the campus of Birzeit University, which was set up by Tawoon, the largest Palestinian NGO, and Tawoon means welfare, but where their collection was absent. And because of the complexity of operating under military occupation, and hence now, for instance, most recently, the collection is digital, but by the opening of the museum, the collection was set up as a garden, as a collection of seeds that are planted in the garden, and that the seeds are really the point that the Hope here builds something across, in the sense of how to, in the islands in the archipelago of islands that the partition and occupation have made latent, try to break through in the soil, in the construction of the terraces of the soil, where the site sits at the top, the building first builds at the top, but a sequence of terracing that inherit the geometry from the main building are treated to orchestrate a sequence of seed libraries. And these seed libraries keep the memory of tradition and culture alive, so that what cannot flower now might flower later elsewhere, in hands not yet born. And there's also obviously a mirror with Vivian Sansour's Harlem library in Batir, but where the mind leaves a hole, the seed keeps a promise. And so Lara Zureiket, a Palestinian Jordanian landscape architect based in Amman, who notably could only travel once to site before design started, and she had never seen it finished. She had never, all the construction supervision was done through FaceTime connections, really made, I think, an amazing repository of imagining these sequence of gardens. And that led me and my partner at the time in this research endeavor, Megan Otong, based at UCT, reflect on how can we really celebrate this question of the gardens. And we were invited to contribute a chapter to a book that wanted to reflect on post-war conditions. And we started by stipulating that something is wrong with the word post. It implies an end. It implies that somewhere, at some moment, violence stopped and something else began. That there is a seam in time legible before and after, and that we are writing from the after side of it. But there is no such seam. The war has no hyphen, suffix, or clear line. It is not a phase. And it's the ground itself, what the ground is made of. And so we started producing collages, and you see here a couple, that look at gardens in occupied West Bank as a interaction between a map, a picture, a drawing, a section that sort of celebrate 5 gardens and acts of remaining, 5 answers to a question that has no answer, which is how does one reconstruct when the reconstruction is being destroyed in the same gesture it is being built? How do you build for a future that is being denied while your hands are still on the tools? And now the ground gives way to the body, and I want to be careful and brief. This is a passage between sort of the ground, the seed, the wound that would lead to the rubble. The wounding of the land and the wounding of people are one terrain, interrupted genealogies. The families made to rebuild themselves while the rubble is still being made around them. And I place the wound before the rubble as the order makes the argument. It comes first because it is what makes the rubble. The wounding of bodies, the wounding of land are a single act, and the debris, the dust, are what that act leaves behind. And I will let one voice speak here from inside a disaster. And just a few days ago, at the end of June, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, Pier Battista Pizzaballa, speaking in Bergamo, said that, and I quote, "Gaza is a disaster." And that today, more than ever, it matters to understand how the other thinks and how the other suffers. But really, I have little to add to the description he offered. And I think that that is really also the honest response. Not to berate the point, but to let those emotions sit. And it also points to the question of the camps, right? Jenin, Tulkarem, Nablus, where the idea of the Nakba translated itself into this suspended grounds outside sort of the law, where the idea of being a refugee and remaining as a refugee was seen by the occupying power precisely a threat because of the right to return. And hence the destruction in the camp becomes even more violent than at times elsewhere. And the collection of craters and stuff makes them think really to the speed in which this project advances. And last year, with Abed Kitana, Alessandra Gola from the Yala Project, and Runa Johannesson, I worked on an installation for the Copenhagen Biennale titled "Time as a Tool of Its Injustice." And its subject was exactly that. Try to put together in sort of a parallel view the history of the colonial occupation and the resistance and the indigenous resistance. And at the center sits a question of justice. Something that, when applied, unfortunately, to the Palestinian question, but also in other places, rests on an historically shifting balance between equality and freedom. And what the installation tried to make visible is how colonial time accelerates faster than the time of the indigenous world building. And it did so by setting 2 screens next to each other. And so that you would see basically these 2 movies. And what they show was the difference in speed. On the one hand, a bulldozer raising a neighborhood in a few hours. On the other, a terrace that takes thousands of years to be built and be painstakingly cared for. A seed from the Harlem Seed Library that would, as referenced earlier, carry the line that has lasted for centuries. An olive tree that gives its first fruits after decades. Colonial occupation instead works at the scale of the hour, the day. The remaining works at the scale of the century and the millennium. It's a physical difference of time. Again, the clocks I referenced earlier into the notion of master plan, and it's also a physical manifestation of the difference of power. And to sort of come to, let's say, the conclusion, we reach the ground the title promised you. Sheria Mariam Raj literally recently wrote, "Welcome to the rubble-based order." And let me give you the figure and let it sit. More than 68 million tons of debris now cover Gaza, laced with unexploded ordnance as benches as humans remain. No single building, surface itself, it's the ground in which people sleep, cook, wash, and participants in the workshop were exposed to that directly the other day. The rubble, in other words, is not a phase between old and new, it is the here and now. And picking up the thread from the wound, the reconstruction that everyone is so eager to discuss, including partly at the workshop, answer a wound that has not closed, because the act that produces the rubble has not stopped. And that, I think, asks us really to engage with what does that mean. And this logic does not end there. It extends, right, in southern Lebanon, in occupied Syria, where other sort of buffer zones that the occupying power has imposed, whole towns are dismantled, razed to the ground, and the yellow line, this sort of abstract figure, runs kilometers inside other states. And the same method travels from one place to the next, refined in one context and applied in another, and it produces rubble at the speed at which rubble can be manufactured. To rebuild can mean to pour the foundation of the very order that made the rubble. This is what I mean when I call such reconstruction impossible. It is not that nothing can be built, and it is being built. It is that building under such a regime risks completing the work of destruction by other means. And so I want to set against it, and these are sort of my most recent texts, since now my work has taken a more theoretical turn, which hopefully sort of, let's say, the presentation made clear, against sort of this idea of resilience, of staying, of remaining on the ground where every president is arranged to remove the custodianship of what survives in the work of people such as Riwak here, the Yalla project, the unbuilt practice by DAR, the quiet insistence of object of repair that Architects for Gaza showed in Venice. In all of these, agency does not mean the power to shape a finite form. It means the capacity to sustain a relation, to hold the ground, even as rubble, as ours, and to keep it addressable as a future. Nasser Abu-Rame last year, or in the end of 2024, famously finished a piece by positing that Palestine is the living archive of our future. And I will let that stand as a way to close. Because of what I've tried to show you tonight is that the ground is never only under our feet. It is met and read, it is emptied by law and by the mind. It is attacked, and it becomes rubble, which is now the ground. To remain present on such a ground and to keep thinking politically, given that neutrality is not an option, when the very basis of life has been reduced to debris, is not a task for Palestinians alone. It is a task of everyone in this room, on this planet, and particularly in a city such as Pristina that has itself been rebuilt from a ground once torn apart. And with it, I want to salute sort of Bekim and the Kosovo Architecture Foundation initiative of dedicating this workshop to the cause. Thank you.